I was going through the drive-through bank. I was going to make a deposit. And that little drawer came out, and I put my check and my deposit slip in it. I wanted some cash back, and I had that on the deposit slip, and I said to the lady inside, "Give me 20s," which she did, and I drove off. I was kind of in a hurry, so I didn't look at it, and got back to my office, and I was going through that, and she had given me $20 too much. What do you think I should have done? I could have said, "Her tough luck. She should have done her job better." I could have said, "That's my good luck." I got in my car and took it back. What would you have done? When Arlene was working for Bryan and Welburn, she used to use part of her lunch period to run errands and do shopping. And one day she had a list of things she needed to pick up. She went in the store. One of the things she needed was some sewing thread. You know, the kind that's on the spool. And she found it and went on to pick up the other things on the list and inadvertently put it in her pocket. And when she got up to the cashier, obviously she didn't pay for it, and she just walked out. She's a thief. She got back to the office and put her hand in her pocket. There was that spool of thread. What do you think she should have done? She could have said, "Oh, that's such a little thing. It only represents a few cents." Or she could have said, "I'm going back and pay for it," which is what she did. You think she did the right thing? What I would like to think is that each of us would do the same thing if we were in those situations. Because to do otherwise would be to steal, wouldn't it? Now, the last prophet in the Old Testament, Malachi, asked this question of ancient Israel. He said, "Will a man rob God?" And he doesn't answer the question directly because it's a rhetorical question. They were robbing God. You know how they were doing it? They were giving to God less than their best. Their hearts were not in tune with God. They had forgotten God. And Malachi said, in effect, you are stealing from God. This is the second in a two-part message where we are dealing with the true measure of a gift. And I want to begin today by looking at the background of what the Apostle Paul said in our text that was read a few moments ago from 2 Corinthians chapter 9. The church began in Jerusalem, and literally thousands were obedient to the gospel, and it wasn't long until the gospel was taken outside of Jerusalem and outside of the nation of Israel, and some had gone as far as Antioch up in Syria with the gospel, and many were obedient to it. And when the church in Jerusalem heard about it, they wanted to encourage those new converts, and so they sent a man by the name of Barnabas. His name means encourager, and that's what he did, and that's why they sent him. And when he got there and he saw what the grace of God had accomplished, he rejoiced, but he needed some help. And so he went over to Tarsus, where he knew his old friend Saul lived. Saul had been a persecutor of the church, but he had come to obey the gospel. He would be an apostle of Jesus Christ, but it hadn't been long since his conversion, and so Barnabas went to get him so that he would help him. And for a whole year, they assembled with the church in Antioch, and many people were added to the Lord. But then Acts chapter 11 tells us that there were prophets who came up to Antioch from Jerusalem. And one of those prophets, Agabus, said that the day was coming, and it wasn't too far into the future, when there would be a great famine cover all the Mediterranean world. But it especially, we believe, would be bad in the land of Israel. There was going to be a famine. Now, notice how the church in Antioch, though it was an infant church, the people hadn't been members of the church very long, but notice how they responded. Each one, according to his ability, gave for the welfare of those who would suffer from the famine in Jerusalem, and Paul becomes involved in all that. And he and Barnabas take the money to Jerusalem, give it to the elders in the church, and the people had given because they cared about the sufferer. Now, not only did Paul encourage people in Antioch to send relief to their neighbors to the south, but he went on preaching tours across Asia and even over into Europe, and everywhere he went, he told the people of the people over in Israel who were suffering from the famine and encouraged them to help as well. And when he came to the city of Corinth, a city of Greece, one of the leading cities, by the way, and a very wealthy city, and in it there was a wealthy church, he encouraged them to help. And they said, we will. We will make a substantial gift to help our brethren over in Judea. But then they forgot about it. And a whole year passed by. They hadn't done anything. They made a promise, but they hadn't fulfilled it. And Paul wrote this second letter to the Corinthian church, partly to remind them of their promise and to encourage them. To encourage them to do what they could do to help. As a matter of fact, in 2 Corinthians chapters 9 and 10, we have inspired motivators given by God to His church to encourage us with our gifts. And the true measure of a gift is found in these two chapters. Now that's the background. Last Sunday we talked about a part of this, and I want to notice what we've learned so far. And here's what we learned. We learned that God owns everything. We learned the ownership of God. We all agree with that, don't we? God owns everything. Psalm 24, verse 1 says, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof." Everything belongs to God. Second, we learned the stewardship of men, our stewardship. And a steward is one who handles what belongs to somebody else. And we're stewards. God owns it all. He gives us some of it to manage for Him. And in managing what He gives us, we have houses to live in, cars to drive, clothes to wear, food to eat, and we have some that we give for the welfare of others. So there is the ownership of God, and there is the stewardship of man. And 1 Corinthians 4, verse 2 says, it is required of a steward, that's us, that a man be found faithful. Number 3, we have learned that a sacrifice given to God to further His work must be the best we have. Now, your best may not be my best, and my best may not be yours, but we all want to do the best that we can. And that kind of sacrifice God honors because it is well-pleasing to Him. And then notice in the 4th place, I want you to remember these words. If you get other words, remember these. When God deals with our stewardship, He gives to us the obligation of trust. The obligation, that's a responsibility, the obligation of trust, because He gives us a responsibility, but He trusts us. He trusts us to do what we should. Have you ever wondered why God did not tell the church how much we should give? He told ancient Israel that they should give a tithe or a tenth of what they had. I've heard members of the church in our time say something like this. Well, of course, Israel had to give a tenth because they not only supported the temple, but they had to support the government, and on that goes. But I don't think we want to go there, because in reality, Israel gave 3/10 every year. They gave 30% for all that God asked them to do. And one of the problems that Malachi mentioned in his book that I was talking about earlier was that they had failed in their tithes and offerings. And then he challenged them by saying, if you will do what you're supposed to do and what it's right for you to do, I will open the windows of heaven and pour out a blessing that will be so great you will not be able to receive it. So there is reward for doing the right thing. Our motive ought to be higher than that, but that's a part of it. There's reward for doing the right thing. It is the obligation of trust. Many years ago, A.M. Burton walked into Nashville, Tennessee. He was a young man leading a cow on a rope and holding his little sister's hand. And that's all they had in the world, was what they were wearing and that cow. He sold the cow and got enough money that he could provide a place for them to live and enough to eat until he could get a job. And he did get a job, and he did well. In a few years, he entered into the insurance business and finally was the CEO of the Life and Casualty Insurance Company of Tennessee. He built an office building that at that time was the tallest building in the southeastern part of the United States. He literally gave away millions of dollars. As a matter of fact, he gave $1 million to one school in Nashville. And measured by today's standard, that would be like $10 million today. And one day he called the president of that school. He said, I want to tell you what my goal is. He says, my goal is to give it all away before I die. How much? All of it. I'm going to give all of it away before I die. And when he was in the hospital for the last time before his death, the president of the school went to see him. And when he walked in the room, A.M. Burton said, I want you to know that I've been successful. I've given it all away. Now, you may be thinking, if I had been A.M. Burton, I would have given it all away too. And so I need to tell you a story. Preacher went out to the farm to talk to the farmer about his giving. And the farmer said, Preacher, if I had $1 million, I would give half of it to the church. And the preacher said, how about selling that cow over there and giving that money to the church? And the farmer said, that's not fair. You know I got 2 cows. There's a lesson there somewhere. It's not what you would do with $1 million if riches should ever be your lot. It's what you're doing right now with the $1.50 you got. That's true, isn't it? God gives us the obligation of trust, and He just tells us, you do the right thing. Those who have more, He expects more of. Those who have less, He expects less of. Now let's come to the text that was read from 2 Corinthians chapter 9. And let's notice the confidence that Paul had in the Corinthians. Now, remember the setting. Paul is raising funds for the poor saints of Judea. Corinth is a rich church. They say, we'll make a substantial gift. A year's passed and they haven't done anything. Now, Paul had just laid down these divine motivators in chapter 8 that we studied last week. And this is how chapter 9 opens. Now, concerning the ministering to the saints, the poor saints of Judea that need this help, it is superfluous for me to write to you. In other words, he's saying, I really don't need to say any more because I said it in chapter 8. But there's one thing more I do want to say. In verse 2, he says, for I know, there's his confidence, I know your willingness, about which I boast of you to the Macedonians, that Achaia was ready a year ago, and your zeal has stirred up the majority. There are 3 words here that come to mind when we read this text. One is, he said they were eager to do it. He wasn't having to beg them to do it. They were eager to do it. He's just encouraging them to follow through with what they promised, and he's confident they will. The second word is suggested by the last line of verse 2. Your zeal has stirred up the majority. They were doing it with enthusiasm. They weren't doing it because they had to do it. They were doing it because they wanted to do it. And did you notice he talked about Macedonia and Achaia? Now, Corinth was in Achaia. It's like Tyler is in Texas. So he's talking about the Corinthians in Achaia, but he speaks of their neighbors to the north, the Macedonians. Do you remember that he said something about the Macedonians in chapter 8? He said they were in deep poverty. They weren't rich like Corinth. And Paul said to the Macedonians, I'm gathering funds to help the people in Judea, but you don't have to give. You're poor yourselves. And he says they begged us for the favor. They said, Paul, you can't keep us from giving. We're giving. He said, your zeal has stirred up the majority. So there's eagerness on their part. There's enthusiasm. And Paul is simply encouraging them to do what they're able to do. Paul's confidence. Now, some of you may remember If you have or have not, I want to remind you that in chapter 8, 2 Corinthians 8, and verse 8, Paul had said to the Corinthians, by what you're going to give, you're showing the true measure of your love. Your love for the Lord is demonstrated by what you're going to give. So my question as we come to the latter part of our text is, how does love abound in sharing what we have for the welfare of others? And Paul answers the question here. Let's come down to verse 6. These are familiar words, I'm sure, to many of you. But then I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. And he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Do you believe that? It's the Word of God. You give and God will bless you for it. Should I have a higher motive than what I'm going to get out of it? Yes, sir. But that's a part of the reality. So he's saying to the Corinthians, I want you to participate in this need extravagantly. Because you're able to do it. I want you to be extravagant. But then look at verse 7. So let each one give as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver. I want to emphasize cheerful. That word means hilarious. It's like the Macedonians. They're poor, they have little, but they're going to participate. It reminds us of the story Jesus tells having to do with a visit that he made in Jerusalem. He went to the temple area and he saw this widow who didn't have much to give in the temple area. And he watched the rich put their much in. And then he saw this widow put in her 2 mites, which would be like 2 cents today. And he did not take note of how much the rich put in, but he took note of how much she put in. And he complimented her by saying, she gave all she had. That's hilarious giving. Don't even now know how we're going to do that. It's hilarious giving. Or it reminds us of the woman who came to Jesus near the time of his crucifixion and broke that alabaster box and poured out that precious fragrance upon Jesus that was worth about a year's salary in that day. The disciples didn't understand it. Why was this waste? And he said, leave her alone. She's done what she could. She's done what she could. He didn't say she's done what she would. She would have done more. But she's done what she could, and nobody can do more than that. So Paul said, I want you to sow bountifully, extravagantly. I want you to do it as a cheerful giver. That is, cheerfully as well as extravagantly. And then, number 3, the beginning of verse 7 says, let each one give. It's personal. In the same line of verse 7, as he purposes in his heart, it's with purpose. It's not just reaching in one's pocket and giving whatever is there, but he's thought about it. What are the needs? What am I able to do? How has God blessed me? What would God want me to do now? It's with purpose. Give as he's purposed in his heart. Now notice this, verse 8. Let's take this to our hearts. and God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that you, always having all sufficiency in all things, may have an abundance for every good work. What is that promise? If you will obey God, He's going to bless you. Not only are those that are helped blessed, He's going to bless you. We need to be obedient to God. Now, how do we bring all this together? The true measure of a gift. Two members of the church were talking. One of them said, you know, they're always having needs down at the church. And they're always asking for money down at the church. And the other Christian said, let me tell you something. He said, when our little girl was born, from the very beginning, she had needs. She was always needing something. She started a school and she needed more because there had to be clothes bought for school and there had to be supplies. And then she was 16 and got her driver's license and felt like she needed a car. And so here we go. And there was going to be college. She was always needing something. But then one day she died. And he said she doesn't need anything anymore. As long as the church is growing and alive and flourishing, the church will have needs. But I want to underscore something that Aaron said in the beginning. Not only does the church have need in fulfilling the mission that God has given us, but you and I have the need to give. It's not because God needs it, but we need it. Because as members of the body of Christ, we are seeking to be better than we are, and God is going to use our generosity to make us better people. And this church has been so generous. In 2014 and 2015, 3 times we asked for a special contribution so that we could build and complete this building, and every time you answered. In those 2 years, as special offerings, you gave $250,000. And then on a weekly basis, in this last year, 2015, this church, though our membership's only in the neighborhood of 300, we gave about $500,000 in our regular contribution at $10,000 a week. This is a generous church. But now we face a new year, and in this 2016, we have obligations that we didn't have before because we didn't have this building before. And sometime we must share with you why we needed a building just like this one. And we don't want to quit anything that we've been doing. We don't want to cut our missions. We don't want to cut the funds that we use for helping our young people. We don't want to cut anything. And with this year's mission and this year's obligations, we need to give 10% more this year than we gave last year. Last year, our budget was about $10,000. This year, it's about $11,000. We need 10% more than we gave last year. would you prayerfully and carefully, in light of your blessings, consider raising what you give by 10%? Now, I know there's some who can't do that, and we're not asking you to. Some of us can do that, and we're asking you to do that. And it may be that in your family, you really haven't been giving your fair share. And this would be a great time for you to prayerfully consider with your family what God may be laying on your heart to do. But that's what we're asking. And we believe that our direction is correct. We believe our foundation is right. We believe that God is blessing us as a special people at a special place, at a special time, to do a special thing. And we believe that with God's help, this church will be a great influence for good. Not only in our community and in our brotherhood, but throughout the world. But you know what the key to all this is? It's what Paul said about the Macedonian Christians in chapter 8, verse 5 of 2 Corinthians. He said they first gave themselves. Oh, if we could capture that spirit, first give yourself. Then God has all of us. If we'll give ourselves, we'll do what we should. And that's the beginning of the Christian life. It's the first heartbeat of conversion, and that is we give ourselves. And here at the first part of the year, I hope that all of us will consider our giving and do what we can. But I challenge us to also consider our commitment. If you've never given yourself to the Lord, today is the day to obey the gospel. They first gave themselves. Could we help you with that today? Let's be standing and singing.